Okay, I'm not sure how much you guys are going to like. Well, okay, this here, I just want to again, go over completing the square. Okay, I'm going to keep kind of pounding this. Find the value for c that makes a perfect square trinomial, then factor the resulting expression. Okay, once again, you want to end up with a parentheses to the second power. That's the end game. Okay, so you got 1, that's a, and b is 10. But to find the c, I need to divide b divided by 2 and take it to the second power. So the b is 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 to the second is 25. So then my c is 25. Well, okay, what's that going to factor into then? Okay, so I take a times c, it's just going to be 25. Positive, so we'll start with negatives, and I want to add this so that I can get positive 10 out of the two factors. Well, the square root of 25 is 5, okay? So it's got to be 5 and 5. Now that adds to negative 10, but I need positive 10. So I'm going to make these both positives, okay? Okay, so I make two parentheses. The a is just a 1, so again, that I can write that now as x plus 5 times x plus 5. Which of course is x plus 5 quantity squared. Okay, now the next one. Now you have a quadratic equation in standard form. You need to write it in vertex form using this complete the square technique. Okay, so again, that's going to be the 3 where I go y equals out 3 times. Kick out your minus 16. Now remember, your a is an implied 1, okay? So I put 1x to the second, that's a. And if a is already a 1, you don't need to put anything here and divide, okay? b, 6, and then I'm looking for my new c. Okay, so I go b divided by 2 to the second. So b is 6. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. Then 3 to the second equals 9. So you're bringing 9. Now, after you bring in that 9, I want you to write something. I want you to write balance. There's a number you have to balance because you just brought it into the equation. So you just brought 9 in. Now, check the front of the parentheses to see if I put a number there. I didn't. So it's just 9 that I have to balance, a plus 9. Okay? So I'm going to balance plus 9. So that means if I brought in plus 9 here, I got to bring it in here. But I don't want it next to the y, so I'm going to minus it from this side and then minus it from the negative 16. Okay, now I factor that trinomial. It's going to be a perfect square. 1 times 9 is 9, positive, and I'm looking to add to get to positive 6. Well, if you find the square root of 9, it's 3. It'd be 3 times 3. Okay, and that you could start with them both negatives, but that's going to be negative 6, okay? So we need to switch the signs so they're both positive. Okay, now a is just a 1, so I just need two parentheses. Once it's there, once I find the factors, it's x squared plus 6x plus 9. Well, that factors into x plus 3 times itself. Then negative 16 minus 9 is negative 25, so put minus 25. So I write that as x plus 3 quantity squared minus 25. And now it's in vertex form. This equation is the same as this. It's just in a different formation. Okay, next one. Rewrite the equation in vertex form. Same thing, okay? But you run into a little problem here. You're going to kick out the minus 2, but we want that a. We want our a we put here to be a 1, okay? That can't happen with that 5 there, so you got to divide this by 5 and this by 5. Don't leave that as 40, okay? So, now don't just get rid of the 5. Remember to put the 5 in front down there, and it stays in front. So it's going to be 1x to the second plus 8x, so that's my b. Plus, and I'm trying to figure out my c. So I come over here, I use b divided by 2 to the second power. So my b is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 to the second power is 16. Now, underneath that, write the word balance. So you're going to put 16 there. But now put balance and then put 16. Now look in front. This time there's a number there. So you brought in the product of 5 and 16. So I take 16 times 5, and that's actually positive 80. Okay, that's the number we got to balance. So it's positive 80, so I plus 80. But then I quick minus 80 from the negative 2. Okay, and that'll be negative 82. Now I got to get this factored into two different parentheses. Ought to be the same. So 1 times 16 is 16, positive. We're going to add it to try to get positive 8. Should be the same two factors. Square root of 16 would be 4. 4 by 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. They wouldn't be both negative because that'd be negative 8. They'd both be positive. Okay, now the 5, you keep dropping that 5. That stays, okay? Now you factor that into two parentheses, and it's x plus 4, x plus 4. And negative 2 minus 80 is negative 82. So we factor that into x plus 4 to the second minus 82. Okay, find the value of k that makes a perfect square trinomial, okay? So you got to find... You know that to make a perfect square trinomial, it can be written as two parentheses with the same thing inside. Well, if you have 25, that had to be 5, So you find the square root of 5, but that wouldn't be the k, okay? Because remember the 5 would be double. There'd be 2 of them. So the square root of 25 is 5, but then we take it times 2, and that's 10. K equals 10. So x squared plus 10x plus 25 would be a perfect square trinomial, because if I go to the t-chart, 25, that's 5 times 5. That adds to my 10. Okay, now the next thing is really easy. Now so far, basically the only thing, and I'm going to teach you a few other things here, okay? The thing about I we learned yesterday is that I to the second is equal to negative 1. Now you want to find out what I to the 6 is. It's not quite as simple as you're going to think. You don't take negative 1 to the 6th power. You're going to break this I to the 6 up, and you're going to break it up into a bunch of I to the second. So I to the second, that's 2 of them, times I to the second, there's 4 of them, times I to the second, there's 6 of them. And then each one of those is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. Now multiply them, that's your answer. So that's positive 1 times negative 1 would be negative 1. Okay, I to the 8th, same idea. I second, there's 2, there's 4, there's 6, and there's 8. So I go negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. So that's positive 1 when I multiply these two. Now I'm at negative 1. Now I'm back to positive 1, right there. I to the 4th, I to the second, there's 2. I to the second, there's 4. 2, 4. So negative 1 times negative 1, that's positive 1. I to the 10th. Now, you can kind of go from here. If you look at your I to the 8th, you're at 1. I'm guessing I to the 10th then. By the way, an odd power won't work. It's got to be even, because then you'd have to have an I to the 1st, which is not negative 1. So you have I to the 2nd times I to the 2nd times I to the 2nd, 2, 4, 6, 8, and then 10. Negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. So that's 1. Now we're to negative 1, then we're back to 1, then we're to negative 1. So as I predicted, if I to the 8th, so what would I to the 12th be, okay? Because that's your problem right there. If you know it, you can just write it and you're done with that part. Okay, now you guys are not going to be fans of the next thing, okay? So let's find the quotient. Quotient means division. 5 plus 3i divided by 7i. Now there's some things I need to point out for this to make sense. And even if I do, I'll do my best. The work actually isn't that hard, okay? But understanding what you're doing can be. Now, if I give you 8 divided by 4, we all know that's 2. But what about 8 divided by I, okay? Well, I not I to the second, but I, just I, is equal to the square root of negative 1. Well, the square root of negative 1 doesn't really exist because, 1 times 1 is 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So the square root of a negative doesn't really exist. That's why it's called an imaginary number, I, okay? Now, how do you divide 8 by a number that doesn't even exist? Like up there, 8 divided by 4, that exists. But 8 divided by I, how do you divide by a number that doesn't even exist? Well, you're not actually going to divide it. You're going to simplify it so I'm not dividing by I, okay? That's the end game. So you don't have an I on the bottom in the denominator. There's a technique to it that makes it not too hard. Okay, you're going to multiply this by another fraction. And as far as what you're going to multiply by, if you have a plus in the expression or a minus, you want to put it in parentheses. See, I put that one in because it has a plus. This one I don't because there's no plus or minus. Okay, just leave that. Now here's a question. Does your bottom have a plus or a minus? No, I didn't put a parentheses around it. So if I didn't put a parentheses around the bottom, I'm just going to multiply by I, both the top and the bottom. Now, here's why I can get away with that. Because let's say the fraction a half. If I multiply that by, let's say, 3 over 3, same numerator, same denominator. That's 3, that's 6. Well, 3 over 6 is still a half. That'd still be 50%. Now, variables work the same way. That is equivalent to 1 right there. It's the same thing on top as I have on bottom. So I can multiply a fraction by 1. Now, here's how I figure this out. Make your fraction line. You just need to apply the distributive property. You take I times 3i and I times 5. And right there, put a t, that's the top, that's the bottom. Or you can put n and d for numerator and denominator. So I times 3i and I times 5. Okay, I times 3i, it's going to be 3i to the second. But we know 3i to the second, I to the second can be replaced with negative 1. And 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. Now, I times 5 would be 5i. So on top, okay, I now have negative 3 plus 5i. Now, how about on bottom? On bottom, I just take 7i times I, which is 7i to the second. And I can replace that with negative 1, so that'd be negative 7. So in the denominator, I have negative 7, and now I'm no longer dividing by the I number. I mean, there's an I on top, which is fine, but at least you don't have it, you don't want it in the denominator. Okay, next one, same idea. Put a parentheses around the minus or the plus expression. You won't put it on bottom because there is no minus, there is no plus. So again, since the bottom doesn't have a parentheses, we're going to multiply by just the letter I. And then on top, distributed property. I'm going to take I times 8. And then I take I times negative 6i. So this is 8i, and then this is going to be negative 6, and then I to the second. But I know I to the second is negative 1, and negative 6 times negative 1 is 6. So you write that as 6 first plus the 8i. Okay, now in the denominator, you take 3i times I. And that's going to be 3i to the second. But we know that's negative 1, and 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. So you have negative 3. Now you no longer have I in the denominator. Okay, that's pretty much what you do on the first half of this. Okay, put a parentheses if you have plus or minus. Don't need it here. So since I don't have parentheses on bottom, I just multiply by I over I. Okay, so I distribute I. I take 8 times I. And I take 7i times I. So it's 8i. And that's 7i to the second. So I to the second is negative 1, and then that's going to be negative 7. So you write negative 7 first, plus 8i. Now on the bottom, you're going to be taking 2i times I, which is 2 with I to the second, and that's replaced with negative 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Okay, now I found the quotient. Again, parenthesize the plus. Here I don't put a parenthesis, so again, I'm multiplying it by I and I. Okay, so I apply the distributive property. I take I times 6 and I times 7i. Doesn't matter which one you do first. 6i, 7i to the second. I to the second is negative 1. 7 times negative 1 is negative 7. So I have negative 7 plus 6i on top. That's my new numerator. Now on bottom, we take negative 5i times I. That's going to be negative 5i to the second. Okay? Again, that's negative 1. I to the second is, and that's 5. Okay? Now I no longer am dividing by I. Now, the next problem is the game changes. This is why it's so important to get the parentheses. So you got a plus there, put that expression in parentheses. And you got a plus here, so put that in parentheses. Now, since you now have a parentheses on bottom, you no longer can just multiply by I. Because if I apply the distributive property, yeah, 7i times I will be 7i squared, but then I'll have to take the I times 8, and we'll still have an I on the bottom. That's not cool. What you do when you have a parentheses on bottom, you're going to switch the plus to a minus, and you're going to go 8 and 7i. Same thing as there, you just switch it. It's called the conjugate method, okay? And on top, you need to multiply by the same thing, 8 minus 7i. Now you need to apply the FOIL method to your numerator and denominator. So you go 3 times 8, then you go 3 times negative 7i, then 2i times 8, and 2i times negative 7i. 3 times 8 is 24, negative 21i, 16i, and negative 14i to the second, but I to the second is negative 1. So negative 14 times negative 1 is 14. So then I combine 24 with 14, which is 38. And then negative 21 plus 16 is negative 5, so minus 5i. If you put plus negative, that's the same thing. Now the denominator, you got to FOIL. You go 8 times 8, and then 8 times negative 7i. Then we go 7i times 8, and 7i times negative 7i. And this is going to get rid of the I. You're going to see why here in a second. So that's 64. That's negative 56i. That's positive 56i. Well, when I add those together, it's 0. That'll be negative 49i to the second, okay, which is negative 1. And that makes positive 49. So 64 plus 49 gives me 113. So that's, okay, same thing here. Put that plus in parentheses, not the top. Don't have to put the top in because there's no plus or minus in there. So again, since the bottom's in parentheses, I now have to multiply by a parentheses, but I switch the plus to a minus. 1 minus I. Okay? I would put 1s in front of those i's there. And the same thing, 1 minus 1i. Now on top, we're just applying the distributive property, okay? Because I don't have two parentheses. I just take negative 2i times 1, and then negative 2i times negative 1i. So it's going to be negative 2i, and that's 2i to the second. Now get rid of the I to the second, it's negative 1. So 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So you have negative 2 minus 2i. Now I is on top is fine. Now the bottom, we apply the FOIL method. When I see two parentheses, what we're going to do, 1 times 1, and then 1 times negative 1i, and then 1i times 1, and 1i times negative 1i. So it's 1, negative 1i, positive 1i, which cancel out, and we have negative 1i to the second. But I to the second's negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And 1 plus 1 is 2. Now, there are some teachers who would make you reduce the 2's so they'd all become 1's. Negative 1 minus 1i over 1, which means the denominator you wouldn't need, but I'm not going to make you do that. Okay, next one, find the quotient. Again, you're not actually going to divide. You're going to actually simplify it so the I, you're not dividing by any kind of I on the bottom. Okay, so get that in parentheses, get that in parentheses. So since the bottom has a parentheses, you switch the minus to a plus. And you put 1 in for I, 1 in for I. Okay, you got a FOIL. 2 times 1, 2 times 4i. 3i times 1, and 3i times 4i. So that's 2, 8i, 3i, and 12i to the second, which when 12 is multiplied by negative 1, it's negative 12. So combine the outer two, negative 10 plus 11i. And bottom, 1 times 1, 1 times 4i, negative 4i times 1, and negative 4i times 4i. So that's 1, that's 4i, negative 4i. Those cancel, and you have negative 16i to the second, but i to the second is negative 1. That makes 16. 1 plus 16 is 17. Okay, last problem. Get the parentheses going, okay? So since your bottom has a parentheses, you're not going to be able to just multiply by just I, okay? You make the plus a minus because that's what we have there, and you multiply. The conjugate is just the same expression except it's a minus instead of a plus. Now FOIL, 5 times 3. 5 times negative 4i, negative 2i times 3, and negative 2i times 4i. So it's 15, negative 20i, negative 6i, negative 8i to the second, okay? That's a negative 1, so that's 8. So I combine those, 23, and I combine those, negative 26. Okay, then on bottom, 3 times 3, 3 times negative 4i, 4i times 3, and 4i times negative 4i. So you get 9, negative 12i, positive 12i, gets rid of them, negative 16i to the second. So it's negative 1. So it'd be 16. 9 and 16 make 25.